Congratulations. I'm very excited for you. So yes, I'm going to be talking about running extensions for VS Code. Kind of to frame this sort of talk, I'm going to start talking about an extension that I've written for VS Code, and that's been my learnings for writing a VS Code extension. I've got this little pretty breadboard and microcontroller up the front. The reason I've got this here, it's the extension I've been writing for VS Code. It's ultimately kind of irrelevant for the full length of the talk, but the extension I've been writing for VS Code is I got this controller here at a conference. I didn't like the tooling that they had for it, so I decided to write my own tooling. And I thought Visual Studio Code seemed like it just announced the extension support. I quite like Visual Studio Code from a lightweight editor perspective, so I thought, well, let's have a crack at writing an extension. So here I've got my extension open and running. I'm just going to hit F5 in Visual Studio, realize that I'm not actually focused on Visual Studio, so I'll hit F5 again. What this has done is it's launched a an extension development host for Visual Studio Code, which is a sandbox version of VS Code that's had my plugin loaded into it. So my plugin is now running. I've got a whole bunch of things that have happened that I'll talk about as we get through this talk. But ultimately what I've got here to start with is a split view. I've got a text editor on one side, and I've got an output window on the other side. An output window is something that you can generate in VS Code if you want to provide messages from your extension to the user. So what I'm going to do is this extension here. I'm going to use the command palette, and I'm going to run the current file using my extension. So what I've got here then, whoops, Windows Zoom, and because these sorts of things don't Zoom have text size increased. So I've got a bunch of extensions here. Esprino is the type of microcontroller I've got, so an extension for Esprino. I've got a couple of custom commands that I've written here that are appearing inside the command palette. And then I'm going to choose this one here, which runs a particular file. And then all it's doing is it's flashing the light on and off, which is basically the code that I've said to do. Zoom back out. This is pumping some messages from the device back up to my output window, along with some initial connection information from the Esprino board. So this has all happened inside of my plugin that's communicating via a node module that I've loaded, talking then through another node module to my USB port, which is then sending some messages to my Esprino board here, which is then sending messages back via node that I'm then writing out to Visual Studio Code. So that kind of is the sort of thing that you can build from Visual Studio Code's extensibility model. I'm just going to reset my device, because otherwise it's going to sit there and flash and annoy me for the rest of the talk. So, with the Visual Studio Code, there's extensibility. There's a bunch of different kinds of extensions that you can do. You can do language extensions. So if you want to create a new language, new programming language, and you want to provide support for that in VS Code, you can do that. All the languages, mostly the languages they've written, are actually extensions themselves. You can write snippet support. So if you're working with a particular platform and you want code snippets, that you can provide them through extensions. You can provide custom themes. You can provide custom debuggers. So say you're working with Python and you want Python support here. You want to also be able to debug a Python app. Then you can have a Python plugin, which is a debugger running over the debugging protocols that Python exposes. So you get the IntelliSense and the syntax highlighting and stuff like that from VS Code. So there's a bunch of different things you can do. What I've got here is just a pure editor extension. So it gives it does a bunch of interactions with the Visual Studio Code editor itself. Primarily, I focused on adding commands to the command palette and then reacting to those commands when they're there. Reading and writing, to things within inside of your current operating workspace. So when you open a folder in VS Code, it creates a workspace, kind of like if you open a solution in Visual Studio, you've got a concept of a workspace that you're working in the scope of. I'm also doing some things with the status bar, which is the blue bar across the bottom that you probably can't really read anything that's appearing there. But there's some things in there that's showing my Git status and sending feedback, stuff like that. So I can interact with that as well. And finally, I've also booted up some output windows with inside of VS Code, so I can then communicate from my extension up to the user that's currently running it. So when you create an extension, the way you create an extension is, I just got to set my node version. I'm just going to create a new folder. Three, and then there's a Yeoman generator for VS Code extensions. You don't need to use it, but it's a whole lot easier to use a template generator to build an extension. If you're not familiar with Yeoman, that's kind of beyond the scope of this talk, but it's a scaffolder for written in Node that you install with npm. So I've got that here. I've already installed the Yeoman generator because we don't need to watch me download like hundreds of megabytes of Node modules. So it's called code. So yo code, and then it asks what kind of extension you want to do. By default, if you're running an editor extension, it's going to prompt you to write it in TypeScript. This is because you get the TypeScript support for writing just purely instead of writing purely in JavaScript, better IntelliSense, better or actual type checking and all that kind of stuff. But you can also do other types of extensions. So if you wanted to do a color theme because you like everything to have a lovely magenta background with white text, you can write your magenta background white text color theme, as well as like language supports and code snippets. So alt net, I'll give it a name. I'll just use that as the identifier. So the identifier is how people would find it in the VS Code marketplace. I'm not going to worry about that. Publisher name is me. I'm told to set up a Git repository. So it's scaffolded out a bunch of files. It's then running npm install in the background. It's just downloading half the internet because this is a Node app essentially, and that's how we install Node, is to download pretty much everything. We'll have a look at what that generates you in just a moment, but I'll go back to talking about the one that I've built earlier. Ta-da! The kind of starting point of everything is your package.json. So anyone that's done Node development is probably familiar with some of the concepts here. Like I said, it's essentially a Node app that's hosted inside of Visual Studio, VS Code. So we have our package JSON, we have names. So name is the identifier and display name is something a bit prettier. So your identifier can't have spaces, and it's got a few restrictions on what you can and can't have in there. So you have a display name, which is actually something people would look for and search for. Description, publisher, what version of VS Code that you're targeting. So as like you might be looking on particular features in VS Code or VS Code's extensibility, so you can specify, no, you can only use VS Code X and above. Where you want it to appear on the VS Code marketplace. Activation events, talk a bit more about activation in a moment. Where is the entry point to your plugin? So the start file. What does your plugin give it? This is really important to set up appropriately, and something that I find a little bit frustrating about writing extensions. So if you want commands to appear in the command palette, so Command-Shift-P or Control-Shift-P, depending on your OS, you've got to list all the commands out up front, and they will always appear within the command palette, regardless of whether once your extension is installed, regardless of whether it's running or not. I find that a little bit annoying because I'll talk about activation in a moment, but you can have things that appear that people might be able to use, but your plugin isn't loaded, so they can't actually do anything, and it just gives you an error message saying plugin is not activated. So that's a little bit annoying. They've added support for things like JSON validation if you want a JSON schema. So that's IntelliSense for JSON files, Bower files, package.json, project.json, those kinds of things. You can also embed like local ones. So I have, for my plugin here, I have a config file that I expect at a particular location. I have a schema written for that. It simply doesn't work. I don't know why it doesn't work. It doesn't give me any error messages. It says it's all cool, but it just does not load the validation schema like I've got defined there, and I can't find any way to debug this or any information online about it, and I can't find any example of someone having done this before, so I don't know what's kind of wrong. But, this is early days, and I'm also pointing out the things that don't work as well as the things that will work quite nicely. It's got a bunch of commands that you can run from just npm from the command line that also get hooked into by VS Code and some of its lifecycle. When you first load a VS Code extension, load a VS Code extension, it will execute the compile script here. So it starts up Node and does a file system watcher on a bunch of files within all the files within inside of your extension. That crashes every now and then, and you can't restart it without restarting Visual Studio Code. And it's really annoying if you miss the message saying that it crashed, because all of a sudden it's not generating output files. So you're writing your TypeScript and nothing is appearing in your output, and it's different. And I've just got a new laptop, so I've just migrated onto my new machine today, and I kept looking going, why is this one file not in my output? It's in my source file, but it's not being generated as output. And I realized that the background compiler had crashed, and it took me about 20 minutes before I noticed that. So that's kind of annoying. It's got you set up dependencies. It's a Node app. So what scope the dependencies are. So something like TypeScript, because it is a TypeScript-based plugin, this one in particular, that's a development dependency. I don't actually need someone to install TypeScript when they're running this, like the production release of my extension. But I have a couple of things that I would want in production. So the Espruino Node module, HTML minifier, because I've got some HTML minifying capabilities, so on and so forth. So our extension is generated and installed everything in the background, load it up, and it's really quite basic in what you've got. We have a source which has an extension .ts, TypeScript, and if I run that, we'll launch our debugging host, and then if I type hello world, I get something here, and it does a rollover message at the top. That's because it scaffolds you up a very basic example of how a plugin can work. And that's what this file is. Extension.ts is the default file that the template generator will create for you. And it has in it this useful bit of code to give you a starting location. The most important thing is the activate function. Who's not familiar with like the ES6 syntax that's kind of on screen, because there's going to be a bunch of it, and I can quickly talk about some of the syntax variations that you might see here. We're all good with like TypeScript or ES6? Excellent. So a VS Code plugin has two primary functions that it looks for, an activate and a deactivate function. The activate function is called when your activation modes are triggered, and it's passed in a VS Code context. Plugins run out of process to VS Code. So unlike Atom, Atom and VS Code have the same heritage in they run Electron under the hood, but Atom runs them in process, and VS Code runs them out of process, and that gives you different performance profiles. So if you've got really like computationally heavy extensions, then they can perform better in VS Code, at least so Microsoft claims. So Activate gives you access to VS Code, an extension context. You can log messages and stuff like that. But we can. What we're doing here is we're initializing a command. So we're registering a new command with some kind of command identifier, and then telling it to do something when the command is invoked. It's good practice to prefix your commands with the ID or the unique name of your extension, or some kind of unique name. The reason for that is you can't guarantee what extensions people have installed on their machines. Someone's installed like 30 extensions. You don't want to have a clash with your hello world and their hello world. So just putting your extension ID in there makes it more likely to be unique. And it can't be guaranteed unique, because someone might also use your ID or just been a dick. But you're giving yourself a bit better an opportunity to not have collisions. Inside a command, so a command, when it's invoked, that's when someone has selected something from the command palette. The function gets executed here, and you can do whatever you need to do from that point in time. In this case, they're accessing the VS Code window, which is just the kind of the shell of VS Code, and it says show information message. So this is just doing that rollover message that we saw when typing hello world. It's an info type, so it appears with blue. I think you can change that with theme colors. There's different ones, so you can do errors, you can do warnings, stuff like that. Text to display. You can also pass in some items that you might want to appear if you want this to be like a drop-down menu of things to select. So an information message, and then they can do something based off of the question that you've asked them. Now I use that with inside of my plugin, because when you boot up the plugin, you want to choose which USB port you connect to. So I list your USB ports, and you select from that. It goes, well, here's your USB ports, choose those. The last bit here is it gives you the ability, so a command that you provided is a disposable object. The idea is that if you're doing something in a command that might be, say, computationally expensive, or holding open, say, a file, access to a file, or in this case, access to a serial port, the USB port, they're called serial ports in the node module I'm using, you might want to handle a shutdown of that cleanly. So you can, with your disposable, you can then provide, you can then set like on disposing essentially. So when that's shutting down, you can execute some code. You can trash your serial port connections and stuff like that. The other method that is exposed here is the deactivate method. That's kind of the global shutdown if you want to do something, maybe display a message to the user. So and that's also triggered when like VS Code is closed by the user. This function gets executed. I was having this is only new in, I think, the last update to VS Code, so I hadn't actually played around with it until today, and I couldn't get it working quite the way I wanted to. There's some known bugs that if you put like breakpoints into the deactivate method, they don't get executed, or don't get hit by the VS Code debugger, because the way they're handling deactivate at the moment. Now, this activate method gives us a nice segue into the activation events. So you might be running a plugin, and you might be running a plugin that you don't want running all the time, or you might be running a plugin that's always available. And the way that you control that is through activation events. There's 3 kinds of activation events. There's on command. So when a command is selected from the command palette, your plugin will then be loaded. This is why I said it's a little bit annoying and confusing that your commands are always there, but your plugin might not necessarily be loaded. I can show you why that could be a problem. So when a command is selected, your plugin is then loaded on demand. This could be useful if you've got like really specific use case scenario commands. In this case, our hello world one, we don't need the whole plugin loaded until someone invokes that command option. Another kind of event is when a particular file is detected. So if you've got a config file, in my case, I look for Esprino.json, but it could be maybe project.json, which is for ASP.NET Core 1.0 and .NET Core 1.0. You might want the whole OmniSharp loaded in the background until you're actually working on a .NET project. It's a whole bunch of code that you're not running. So you might look for the project.json, or you might look for a file match pattern of star.cs. And until it finds one of those, your extension won't be loaded. The other way that you can set an activation event is an activation event of star, which basically means load my plugin regardless of what's happened. That's useful if you've got code snippets that you're injecting, or you've got commands that might take a bit of background processing to load up, or you've just got commands that are kind of always to be available. That's when you might do a star activation. You just got to be mindful that if you're doing a star activation, an always activated plugin, it's going to be a performance hit to the user whenever they start up VS Code, because your plugin is going to be loaded. It's still going to be loaded out of process, but then that's something that your CPU is doing to load that in separately to the way your Visual Studio Code is running. So jumping back to my plugin here, I just was going to talk about I was going to talk about some language design features that you can leverage. So, given the fact that I'm working with TypeScript, and this is designed to run on, it's running on the version of Node that's embedded inside of VS Code. So in the current version of VS Code, that's 4.1.1. So that's it's a fairly recent build of Node. It's got a whole bunch of ES6 features, and that enables us to do some cool things from a TypeScript capacity. We don't have to fully compile down to like old school ES5 or ES3. We can leverage some of the ES6 stuff. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually leveraging a new TypeScript feature called for async and await, which is very similar to C#'s async and await. We have an async keyword at the start of a function, like here on line 10. So async and then parentheses because it's an async function. And on line 20, I've got an await statement. What this is doing is this show quick pick. Oops, if I hover over the statement completion, that returns me a promise. So a promise is essentially an async callback sort of function that is similar to the way a task works inside of .NET. So I await the success response of that, and then I can proceed on to the next line of code. This makes writing my code a whole lot easier than nested callbacks or even just working with promises and then having to do .then and then capture something in essentially a callback pass to the then function and then chaining thens and thens and thens. The TypeScript transpiler takes care of that, turns it into ES6 promise calls, and then the Node engine that we're running on top of supports ES6 promises, which means that we have a whole lot simpler programming approach here, which is kind of cool. This is a different kind of menu display option that I've got here, show quick pick. The way that one looks, if I come back to my plugin running, oops. If I go list ports, so it gives me a bunch of options normally in a drop-down list. I only have one option here in the drop-down list because I only have one there, and I get if I start typing, it does filtering on the available items within the list, so I can select them easier. Zoom back out. So close that, so we got a bit of extra window space. Now, other things that are kind of cool that you can do with VS Code extensibility is the bar across the bottom, which is now orange. Orange is indicating that I've got the debugger attached. I can actually add my own things to that. So if I had something custom that I wanted to add there, I can create an instance. I can use the create status bar method here that I've got on line 9. I can say whereabouts I want it. Do I want it on the left or right of the status bar? So sort of a docking feature. And then from that, I can write to my status bar. I'm doing that here with a plugin, which you'll see show that I'm connected to COM port 3 because so I can talk to my little Espruino module. Disconnect. Well, you couldn't see that happening in the background. I used the command palette to use I've got a disconnect, reconnect, disconnect, connect option, and I chose disconnect, and now it says that the status is disconnected. It's no longer connected to that particular COM port. If I do connect, there we go. You see that it connects. So I can live update that as well. So you can think that maybe you're doing something like you want to do a words per minute or keystrokes per minute counter or something like that. You can just have you're looking at the document every time like the document changes, you're updating your counter there, and then after a minute, it resets the counter back to 0 and shows you how many in the last minute. That kind of really useful metrics that you want to get from your programming. And then when it's just said 0 for like the last hour, you feel depressed.
So something like that. Type faster.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, might start like showing the message of like too slow. Because as I keep saying, this is essentially Node under the hood. We can break our files down into multiple modules. So I've got my code split across a bunch of different files. I can also just use other node modules that I find out in the wild. And this will come to a gotcha that I came across. So I've got the Espruino module loaded here, or inside of my file converter. I have a module called, there's a module called HTML minifier, and I'm using that to do some HTML minification. And I just did an npm install HTML minifier, and then that module is now usable within inside the app. It'll get load up just like any other plugin. One thing you do have to be mindful of if you're writing an extension for VS Code, you're leveraging node modules, and you happen to leverage a node module that is a native node module, so something that's actually written in C++ instead of JavaScript. Say you're talking to a COM port, that's actually done via a C++ extension to V8. That's going to cause you a bunch of problems with running inside of VS Code. The reason for that is that VS Code is running Electron under the hood, and Electron, while it's running Node, it's running a custom build of Node. So a native Node module can't be loaded because the version of V8 is slightly different to the version of V8 that it thinks it should be compiled, or that it's essentially compiled against when you do an npm install, which is what happens when someone installs your Node module. I haven't found a good solution for this yet. I've talked to the VS Code guys, like, we know it's kind of a limitation of Electron, but realistically, there's not that many native Node modules, and the number of people using native Node modules to do a VS Code extension is probably even smaller. So the way that I've kind of worked around that is I've pre-compiled that node, those modules for Electron using, for Windows, using x86, because they have to be x86 compiled, and I'm on an x64 machine. So you got this weird chain, and I keep those checked into source control because I'm sick of having to try and recompile them. That's not super fun or easy. Output windows. Output windows are another useful way useful thing that you can use within VS Code. Again, they're really easy to create. So you just do window.create output channel. You can give the output channel a name. So this can be useful. Actually, let's fire up this plugin again. So I have a drop-down list up here, and this is because you can have multiple output windows within inside of a project. So Espruino is the output window from my little microcontroller. Git. So I'm using Git as the source controller for this, and Git can write to an output window, which is available in VS Code. Tasks, so if I've got custom tasks within VS Code, they can write to output windows, but you can generate as many as you need for your particular plugin. And like I said, it gives you a good communication channel back and forth. Writing to an output window is as simple as calling append or append line and then chucking a bunch of text at it or throwing an object at it. If it's an object, it will be handled nicely by VS Code and will give the user the ability to expand and collapse that object. So you don't just dump this like wall of JSON on them and they're like, oh, but I wanted the message that was directly above that. It's something they can interact with. There doesn't seem to be any way that you can basically create a REPL. So I wanted to create a REPL where you could just like sort of type in and then hit enter and then capture that response. You kind of have to read out of the text documents and then pipe that through to the output window. Kind of a shame, but we might get a better REPL story at another point. The final thing of usefulness that you might want to be doing is actually reading a text file that someone's got up on screen. Let's come back to extension here. And so I have a run file command, which is the one I used at the start. What that does is first do a check to make sure you're actually connected to device and show an error message. So back off the window. So like you can show info messages, you can show error messages. They appear lovely in red. From the window, I can find the active text editor. So that's where your current focus is from. Current keyboard focus is the active text editor. That will give you a text document, and then from that you can call get text. We can do a bunch of other things from text document. So I can get the file name of it. Let's see if I can get text within a specific range, so I can basically do my own highlighting and select subsections of that. I can also check, I actually get the selected text, not the entire text document. I can determine whether the document has unsaved changes. So if I only wanted to, say, send something to my microcontroller that is from a file that someone has saved, then I might check is dirty. If it's dirty, then prompt them and say, hey, you haven't saved. Until you saved, I can't continue. Check what programming language has been used for that file. So you might want your extension only caring about particular programming languages. In my case, JavaScript. If someone's writing in C#, that's not going to work on the microcontroller. So I check that it's a JavaScript file, and if it isn't, then just kind of silently exit or show a message and not continue on. Get metadata about the file. I can force a save of the file. Yeah. With the active text document, I can also force edits onto it. There's our selection. That method is deprecated, so we can't actually forcibly show it anymore. We used to be able to hide and show files, active documents programmatically, but it seems like they're disabling that feature. There's IntelliSense that is dotted off the end that might tell us more, but I'm not quite sure in what context you would want to actually hide the text file or the file that the person was currently editing. So to go back to the activation events, this particular plugin, as I said, I've got a couple of different activation events. If I find the JSON config file, that's when I will boot up my plugin, or when someone uses the list ports command. Any of the other commands, let's just open folder. I'm just going to swap to a different folder. And then restart the debug host. So now I no longer have my extension loaded because it's not found the config JSON. My Reno JSON file. See down here, a little notification that said connected, disconnected is not there. That's kind of the first thing that I do in my plugin, which means that my plugin is obviously not loaded. But if we come back up to the top here, go to the command palette, all the commands are still there. If I hit, say, connect, it goes, whoops, there's nothing handle for that particular thing. Ensure that it's activated. So you've got a choice that you have to make here. One, you go, oh, well, too bad, you get an error message, or you set all of your custom commands to be activation events as well. For me, that doesn't actually work all that well, because if I went list ports, it goes, oh, wait, list ports isn't there, but in the background, it's slowly booting up my plugin, because I actually load my plugin asynchronously. I haven't worked out a way to get around it showing this this error message. It could be just a limitation in the way that extensions work at present time.
Could you load a shell extension that's very lightweight?
Yeah, one way is you basically do as minimal work as possible to bootstrap your extension on activation, and then if you've got asynchronous stuff happening in the background, you do that sort of in the background, and then when that's available, it gets to it. Or you load up all the handlers for your commands, but they kind of defer themselves until all the other asynchronous stuff. Where again, it's kind of you kind of chicken and egging yourself here of like not sure which way you need to go first. Yeah, I think that's kind of all I wanted to really talk about tonight from an extensibility point of view. What I've found in doing this is it's actually been really easy to write VS Code extensions. The IntelliSense, because I'm writing it with TypeScript, has been quite useful. The documentation has not been particularly useful. It's very developer docked at the moment. There's not a great deal of blog posts, particularly when you start getting into the really nuanced things like loading a native Node module. It wasn't until I talked to the VS Code guys that they were like, oh yeah, this is kind of what you're gonna have to do. This is the this is the recommendation, don't load a native node module. This is an option, and this is the hacky workaround. I'm like, sweet. Kind of isn't great for me, but whatever. The final thing that I'm not going to do is how you bundle up and go to the marketplace. There's a node module called VSE, I think it is, that bundles up your Visual Studio Code extension. We'll then publish it to the marketplace. You sign up for the VS marketplace. You get, I think it's like an API token essentially. You give it to VSE, so it identifies you. You publish it, and it goes magically live, and then people can install your Hello World plugin on their machine, and it's like, woo! I got Hello World in my menu. It's pretty easy to finally do the publish up. Any questions?
Can I write VS Code extensions in C# as well?
VS Code extensions in C#? Yes, if you're going to want to try and transpile them down to JavaScript. VS Code extensions are all JavaScript because it's running Node. You might be able to get in a really hacky scenario and use there's a wrapper for C#. For in Node that loads up .NET libraries, so you could compile it .NET and then use this plugin for Node to then load it up. But I think it's a native module, so you're gonna hit that same problem. You're a whole lot better writing in JavaScript or TypeScript. Anyone else?
Great, what you've done. What's the next step?
What's the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to work out how to make it easier to install the plugin from the marketplace, because currently if you install the plugin, it's just it pretty much fails because you've got to do a whole bunch of additional steps to do the native node modules. I want to work out how you can better how can we better support people that want to do use native node modules to do extensions for VS Code. There's a couple of node modules that are out there that are native that are in somewhat common use. They're not the most common ones out there, but they are somewhat commonly used. So it might crop up a bit more as people write more extensions.
Do you see some value to extend that to something like IoT Core?
Whether or not you would run IoT Core plugin, I can actually see value in doing it, because VS Code, it being cross-platform, makes it you a bit more flexibility in doing it cross-plat. I'm only starting to explore the microcontroller space myself, so I don't know a whole lot about the story about other microcontrollers other than the one that I've got in front of me. But this has been a great learning experience for even just how do you talk to something that's got a Wi-Fi module and a USB in? Like, that's all I've got as input. Really, like how do I get stuff on there? And I've got to connect to USB ports and read and write to USB ports and stuff like that. So that's been like a learning experience for me, and then try to build the extension that then can do that. So
okay, that's a learning.
Yeah.
Okay. But otherwise, the value just to work with USB is pretty limited.
There's like, if you can send data over USB, there's a lot of things you can do with it.
Yeah, but it's just a step.
Yeah, exactly. Earlier today I had this running on the Wi-Fi in our office, and just a simple web page, and then like press a button and it turns the LEDs off. I'm like, woo! I can turn lights off with a button. It's like a switch for lights. Yeah. Strobe it up, like having like a really shitty rave in our office. Exactly. Cool. Anything else?
Yeah, you said you can write plugins which can be activated when I load a file. Basically, the language syntax or auto-completes menu providers. So when do they get deactivated?
I haven't. So when do they get deactivated? If you've done it on file matching, I'm not 100% sure. I thought it was going to be when that file is no longer found within the workspace, or something matching that pattern is no longer found in the workspace. I'm not 100% sure if that's true, because, like I said, there's a bug that you can't actually put a breakpoint with inside the deactivate event. So I was trying that earlier today to just see if I swap between was it unloading my plugin and calling deactivate, but my breakpoint wasn't getting hit, and I did some research and found out that it's a known problem that breakpoint's not going to be hit, and also that console log statements are not guaranteed to be invoked. Because it's at the point that it's trying to unload everything from memory and disconnect everything, and it's just gone, well, you've got now a few seconds for a deactivate event to run and just do any cleanup, and at the end of that your process is basically terminated. I got to the point where I was trying to look into the VS Code source code and work out how it was happening, and then realized that I had better things to do with my life this afternoon. Prepare a talk.
And the chakra, what do you call it? Chakra layer that's available. I think it's going to change something.
So, would Chakra Core have any impact on my VS Code extension? I really hope that we see Chakra Core get. There's a pull request out for Chakra Core to be merged into Node. So you've got support for using Chakra instead of V8. I really hope that happens, just from a Node development perspective, because I find V8 is actually quite behind in its ES6 support compared to Chakra, and so I want a whole bunch better ES6 support from V8 and then from Node. In terms of how I would see that impacting in VS Code, well, hopefully then VS Code could also be leveraging Chakra Core as the underlying version of Node that it's running, which means that we get better ES support. So you don't necessarily need a transpile step from TypeScript to JavaScript, that you can just write just JavaScript with ES6 syntax. For my microcontroller, well, given that I think that's got 4 meg of memory, I'm pretty sure I'm not running more than the stripped down version of a JavaScript runtime that they've got embedded in there. One thing that I have thought of as future plans for my plugin is having being able to put in a precompile step, so that you could essentially write a TypeScript app and then have it precompile before it sends it to my microcontroller, and essentially just hooking that into points inside of the VS Code command window. So you run a command and you say transpile, or you just say send to device, and it goes, well, the file is TypeScript. Well, I'm going to transpile that to TypeScript because I understand how to I've got TypeScript as a compiler I can access, and to get the output of that is JavaScript, and then just pipe that through to my serial port, which then pipes it through to my device, and magic happens. Cool. Thanks, everyone.
Is that the French beret?
Pardon?
Is that the French beret, your cap?